ready to get
abuse
started.
because of greed. It's a values issue.
So the first,
Let's
we wanted to
continue.
ask how many people were able to go to the performance last night? Okay, so at least half the room wasn't, so I think it would be good.
It's performance art, but also performance science. Human civilization is enveloped by the earth. Systems of food, energy, economy immersed in soil, water, climate, life. Life and environment interacting, interdependent, inseparable.
It's a theater piece that has a bit of science in it, it has a lot of music in it, and has a whole lot of humanity.
Whole ecosystems can be driven to collapse. 5 times, the fossils tell us, each time triggered by rapid environmental change. These things we know about our planet and ourselves through physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, and the time has come for us to believe what we know.
Even if you have people in the audience who are skeptical about climate change, it's presented here in such a way that it doesn't put people on the defensive.
Earth's bios envelops and sustains us. The carbon dioxide I exhale, taken up by my ficus.
Involving the audience is incredibly powerful. It's that interaction with the audience that is the seminal part of this performance that makes me want to keep coming back.
Rising from system Earth is system us. If everyone consumed the way we do, we would need 4 planets to sustain us. Right now is the time for transformation. Believe what we know. Embrace what we know.
I felt uplifted. I felt like, even the small things I can do or choose to do might actually make a difference.
Living with a mindset of applied hope. We pick something and make it ours with genuine commitment. We won't be alone. Exponential growth in action. Everything is small until it's not. Pick something and make it yours.
Well, if you weren't at the performance, you can tell that it's intense and it's moving and something to talk about. So let's start with introductions. We can just go down the line and then you'll know how everybody's involved in this wonderful performance. Okay, lights, that would be good.
Well, my name is Brad Otteson. As you saw, I was playing the viola.
Robert Waters, violin, 5 string quartet.
Rebecca McFall, violin, Fry String Quartet.
Rebecca Allen, visual artist.
Laura Kaminsky, composer.
Anne Francis, cellist.
Rob Davies, physicist. And I want to clarify too that
Was I wrong about?
no, but it's certainly true that the germ of the idea of this was mine, and I originally brought it to the quartet. But from the time that I brought it to the quartet, they're not just hired guns playing their fiddles. These are full partner co-creators of the project, and the structure that you have, the whole structure of the performance. This has all been co-created by all of us and refined over a number of years. And taking part in that refinement in no small way have been Laura and Rebecca as well. So it's really quite a genuine collaboration, I would say.
So this is a panel discussion, and I really just want mostly your questions to the group. that clearly they are from different worlds, right? They're musicians and artists and physicists and scientists working together, and so this gets right at the heart of the matter in terms of the question that we're addressing. So that kind of sets us up for, I think, any kind of questions, not necessarily just about the performance. So let's start with the basic question of what motivated you to begin working together. I asked that question last night, and everybody had great comments. So I think, is that okay? We'll start there, and that way everybody can get the context.
So the very start of it is 12 years ago. I decided to take a year sort of sabbatical from my world of something called quantum optics and do climate change communication. I just thought I could help, pretty typical physicist, very arrogant. Oh, they don't understand, I will explain it to them. And they will understand and we will fix this. But after about a year of giving these presentations, I felt like I was giving good presentations and audiences were connecting the dots intellectually. It's not, in its detail, the scientific story of climate change is really complex, but distilled to its essence, it is very straightforward. And so you can make it plausible for people to understand what's happening. But it's an audience like you, so I would be here telling people that we're on the hairy edge, and you'd get it, because I would explain it to you. But you'd walk out into your regular life, and it doesn't feel like you're on a very hairy edge, right? I mean, we have nice lives. Most of us have very comfortable lives. I love my life. I have vibrant work. I have a great place to live. It's safe. I have food. All of that, right? So I was looking for a way to connect people more, including myself, more viscerally to this information. And this is what the arts do for us. Films and theater, and for me, chamber music is a powerful experience. I would walk into chamber music concerts back in my physics days and just be scrambling for paper because it's unlocking my brain and all kinds of things that I'm puzzling around. So I came back to Utah State University. We had this amazing resident string quartet, and I'd been going to their concerts, and I thought, well, what if we brought in an audience and pushed out all the little things that they bring in with them with some pretty compelling information and some imagery to reinforce it. So now I'm making you think about this stuff, and now let's unleash the music on it and sit with it and see what happens. So that was my idea. I approached the quartet, and in particular, I approached Anne. This is like, I think 2010 maybe.
That sounds about right, yeah.
I only knew the quartet very casually, socially. Logan is a small town, so we would. Full disclosure, I'm now married to the second violinist. So this is like the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Yay, climate change.
And so I'll let Ann take it from there.
Sustainable impact.
Yeah, so when Rob first approached me, as you said, he had this incredible idea, but not really sure how to actually make it happen. And I immediately said, yes, I'm pretty sure this is something that we're going to want to do, because it was something I knew all the members of the quartet felt strongly about. But without really knowing what that was going to look like, we just sort of jumped in feet first, which turned out to be kind of the case with everybody we approached about being involved in the project. The immediate, yes, and then we'll figure out the rest later. But I loved the idea, not only obviously of trying to help, because I and the members of the quartet had actually, we'd gone to Rob's talks, and so we knew what he was trying to do and had a sense for that. But also, I think the idea sort of a little bit selfishly is like, wow, we have an opportunity to say something about this. We have an opportunity as artists to make some sort of an impact. We all believe really strongly in the power of what we do, the way that we can communicate, through our art form. And it's incredibly, of course, satisfying to do that just with music for its own sake. But the thought of applying that towards something like this, I think was very exciting and inspiring. And so we sort of said, okay, well, let's do this, and then we started talking about how. And we had a lot of early stage sort of trying things. There was a lot of trial and error, trying to figure out, well, what would the format look like? What music would we use? We first tried using existing music that we thought could suit the project. early stage versions of it were so incredibly long because it was so difficult to figure out what information to try to include and what information to leave out. It was very hard to cut it down. I think the first version was about 2 hours long, and so trying to whittle it down from there was really challenging. But pretty early on, we knew that one thing we needed for sure, from the music standpoint, was original music. Trying to use music that was written previously didn't really feel like it was working, and so at that point, we approached Laura, we had a lot of mutual friends. We knew she had written on environmental themes, and this was something that she felt strongly about. And so we contacted her, and I think as the story goes, it was actually Becky who emailed her, and within about a half an hour, they were on the phone together. And Laura, like everyone else we approached about the project, also immediately said, yes, I'm in. We had no idea how we were going to pay her for this string quartet we asked her to writ.
In a really short period of time, too, so
But-
we were a nuisance on all kinds of levels.
Such a good nuisance.
Yeah, but yeah, and you were in.
So if I can just pick up, I think that what made me really say yes, of course, as some of you heard this last night, but every composer wants to get an email inviting them to write music. So that was easy, but it was the idea of this project, because I have been involved in civic activities around environment and human rights issues, and so this speaks to me as a citizen. But I think the thing that made me really get what you were striving for when we had that first conversation was something that Rob has talked about, which is giving the lectures that you would do to rooms generally of scientists, and at the end of the talk, somebody would raise their hand and say, Dr. Davies, I don't agree. It was 0.0642, not 0.0673 in my research. And that was not the point, because that's a scientific conversation about, what's going to go in the paper with the charts. But that's not what people need to take in. And what I realized for me is that what I do is I'm a storyteller. I tell stories by moving sound waves around in time that have some coherence to them, even though they're abstract. So for me, it would be to allow the story not to be about the facts and the science specificity, but the bigger human question around what we're dealing with in this era. And so that was the excitement for me, was that I was getting to move sound waves around with the most amazing people who have the ability to do that on their instruments with such commitment, to help get to the emotional core of the story that's underneath the factual reality of the story, because that's where the change comes from. You have to own it emotionally. And in the further bits of full disclosure, there was the desire to bring the visuals in, and this is my wife. So we're a very happy family. So Rebecca Allen was then auditioned, I guess, by Rob to talk about the visual component of it, and we've been telling this story together ever since.
Well, the audition was, here's some of my work. Wow, this is great. will you do some for our project? I mean, it really is wonderful work.
No, for me it was really about, I think that adulthood is the biggest phase of learning in life, and I knew that, again, selfishly, that this would be an education for me to work with these other people from music and science, and it just really turned me on.
Well, thanks for that description. I want to open it up for questions to this group of people who have produced something amazing.
So I understand that you guys are trying to raise awareness about all these environmental issues and kind of bring dialogue to it. I was wondering if you guys are doing anything to measure that impact that you're trying to make, and how you're trying to analyze that.
So the question is, are you doing anything to measure the impact of the outcomes of this performance?
We are making some efforts. We've got a social scientist on board, actually, and Maggie, and I can't think of her last name.
Clifford.
Maggie Clifford, who's also a singer-songwriter, interestingly.
Like a really great one.
Yeah, she's wonderful. But she created a survey which is available to take on the website. It's on the menu bar. There's a little round piece that has a very, very quick survey to get some feedback. Most of that's a tricky thing, getting a rate of response. It's just enough kind of steps removed from attending and then leaving the performance and being in your head. But we did have a captive audience in our hometown that we made a pretty strict push for. So we do have responses from her efforts, but most of it honestly is anecdotal. It's in audience responses, or again in our hometown where we've done it over time, a number of times. It's easier to see the way that it's had impact on a kind of our community's consciousness.
It's maybe worth saying too that the Kane College of the Arts has made a number of efforts and contributed to a number of efforts in terms of pushing this notion further into the university curriculum, that Rebecca's been involved in particular with, a sustainability fellow that the college funded, the faculty workshop, destinations workshop. They even fund part of my position. And I would say that has largely arisen out of this effort.
Yeah, that wouldn't have happened without this effort.
You could say that the project's become sort of a part of the identity of the college.
Yeah.
A small part of it, but an important part.
So there is the real world question. How did you get funding so that a composer could write a string quartet for you?
Can I
Visualize could
the dean of our college likes to look at us and say with his big deep baritone, relationships, and it really was that. We had the confidence of our development director for the Kane College, and it was a really great meeting. Rob and I went, and I was so nervous. And I was she knew me and not really Rob, so I was making this pitch to her. And she also happened to be the president of the university's wife. So she had kind of access to, she had access on a pretty high level for our institution. And I went in and pitched the idea and said, well, we can start a Kickstarter campaign, and we can, and I was talking too fast. And then she looked at me and she said, okay, well, I think we can get this from the president's office. We can do this, and you can forget about your little campaign. It was, so that actually, it really did come from her knowing our work as a quartet and our involvement in the community at large, and her wanting to also be a part of this message getting disseminated in a way that she felt like was nonpartisan, and but it's kind of as simple as that. There was enough sort of in the bank with that relationship that she trusted it.
It's worth mentioning that the heft, the sort of the gravitas that the quartet brought to this project, because they have a very strong reputation, not just at our university, but nationally. And so if I had been sitting there talking to her, I think she'd have been, what is this? But because she knew them, and not just her, we went to the deans of 6 different colleges, maybe.
Yep.
There were 8 colleges at USU. They all kicked in money, and I'm pretty sure it's because these guys were involved initially, and they said, "Oh, this isn't just some squirrely thing. These guys, they're professional musicians, and they do things professionally." And there was some confidence.
I think just to add to that, and fundraising in general for experimental, big kinds of idea projects like this, that it does take boldness, but in the early phases of thinking about how to fund some of these workshop ideas that we're going to talk about later, I always try to think about who do I know that really cares about this idea, in my own personal circle? Who could I go and talk to and try and have coffee with that person or call that person or whatever to just begin to build these relationships that Becky's talking about? Because it's hard to think about. I don't have my own personal string quartet that I could take into the president's office. I'm an adjunct at a small college, and I work 3 jobs to support myself as an artist. Where would I start? So again, it's still relationships, but it's on this more person-to-person scale of who would pay attention to this, who cares about this.
And also, I think to just pick up on something that Rebecca said, I mean, clearly when you go into a development office, you're asking for money. But when you're building your network of people who want to help you realize your dream, don't talk about the money. They need to believe in your dream. And I think you said it.
Yeah.
Like, think about the people you know who care about the issue you care about, and ask them for their opinions. Say, I'm thinking about this weird project I want to do, and these are the things I've thought about. What do you think? Who do you know? And then you start to build a group of people who are your champions. They believe in that idea because it's something they care about, and then they start to think about it, and they'll say, oh, you've got to meet so-and-so because so-and-so does this. And all of a sudden you have a team of people out there, and maybe at some point the money will arise from someplace you never expected it, and at some point you may ask specifically for that team to provide money, but it's that network of support that provides a community within which you can realize your concept.
I think it can't be underestimated, the value in dreaming together, envisioning this, whatever the idea is, and that's fun, actually,
Fun.
and kind of sharing in that, and bringing those people together. Some of the dreams start to feel possible, and that's also fun.
It's worth maybe also just to tie up the story. So that was the seed money. Came from mainly the King College of the Arts and then a few other colleges to get that premiere performance done and get the quartet paid for, mostly. I think it maybe took us a little while.
You were patient.
But
It
then
wasn't
the
about the
project
money.
itself stirred interest, and we've had a number of private donors, some of them pretty substantial, just come to a performance and say, this was great, we want to keep it going. Now, I think and so it's paid for things like the website development was pretty expensive, and the trailer was also a good chunk to do that. But largely, I think, and Brad's the number guy, but it's largely self-sustaining at this point.
Self-sustaining, I would say that every organization that desires that has presented the Crossroads project has also been a really important part of sustaining the project itself.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So in that way, the community just keeps growing,
Yeah.
both sort of outward and forward in time. It's kept us really sustained over the last 5-6 years.
I think I'm interested in hearing your opinions about presenting your work in a university environment where all of the audience is really pretty much knowledgeable, almost always, about the issues that you're talking about. What about presenting it outside of that environment, and how do you get the people that need to be convinced to see your performance?
Well, one of the things that Rob always talks about is that the purpose of the performance on some level is to take the folks who are already convinced, but to go further.
Right.
And in many ways, I think it's probably most effective there. But we have given it to a range of audiences, and actually maybe I'll ask Robert to talk about an early performance where there were quite a few people who walked out, and it didn't feel friendly like it did last night, I'll hand it to you.
So within the first year of the development of the iteration that you all saw last night, there were a couple of early versions that had a different form altogether. But rather early on in the project, we were asked to invited to come and perform this for a youth orchestra in Salt Lake City by a friend of ours who also plays in the Utah Symphony Orchestra, and she does great work with these high school kids and training them in the orchestral world. And so we were delighted to go and do that, and we did it for these high school kids and many of their parents in a pretty red state, where what we had to say about that particular topic was not uniformly warmly received. And so, and we had, I don't know, between 20 and 30 people probably walked out in the middle of the performance and took their kids, and you know, we didn't actually hear anything that they had to say, but that was its own statement, of
But
course.
Barbara did, she got emails from these parents.
She did.
Yeah.
And it certainly, from the standpoint of a musician and a string quartet, it felt really uncomfortable in a way that no other thing that we had done or could imagine really doing musically would. I mean, no one really sort of says to you, "How dare you play that Beethoven string quartet?"
They do say that about Bartok sometimes.
Maybe it's a little bit of grumbling if somebody doesn't agree with or like the particular piece of music, but this is altogether, of course, a different league. And that's actually, it's one of the few times I can think of where we snuck up on an audience, because most of the time when we do this, whether it's a conference or an academic setting or something that's a little bit more community oriented, and we've done, I suppose probably the academic setting is the one that we've done it the most, but we have done it other settings as well. The audience self-selects.
Yeah.
If they have even just a whiff of what it's about, they already know how they feel about that topic, and they're either interested or they're not.
I mean, I think one of the things that's complicated for people who are trying to create projects that cross these disciplines, that have subject matter and then disciplinary concerns, is there are multiple audiences. So there's the audience who's coming because they want to be involved in the discussion around the Anthropocene and all the challenges to the climate. There are people who love string quartet music. There are people who like seeing multimedia work, and they may be entering for very different reasons. And you know, the challenges can a project like this, and some of you have other projects, satisfy all of those audience members. I mean, if somebody walked in last night who thought, oh, there's going to be a visual display at the cinema of artwork and photography, they might have really been annoyed that there was this guy talking. You know, if somebody came in thinking they were going to a string quartet concert and then there was this guy talking with images, they was like, well, where's the rest of the music? You know, so that issue of how you can bring together different kinds of audiences for this shared experience and have them all let go of the thing they entered with and accept this other form that they've been given, that's kind of, it's not a bad challenge, but that's a challenge to confront.
Maybe to add to that too, especially earlier on, I'm not sure that we've experienced this as much recently. The project 4 or 5 years ago was rather darker than it was last night, and the whole notion was to really kind of rattle people and to shake them into action. And so some of the content, especially towards the end, was quite a bit darker, and we struggled with that. We struggled with really how severe to make that particular part of the performance, because we didn't want Rob often talks about your typical documentary on some disturbing topic. There's the 2/3 of the documentary, which is all the bad news and all the terrible things that are happening in this particular subject, and then there's the happy music comes on, and here are the people who are doing the really great things to help solve this, and you sort of end like, oh wow, well, we're moving in the right direction. That's really great. I'm going to go have a drink now. And it sort of lets you off the hook, and that's something that we really didn't want to have happen in the Crossroads project. And so earlier on, we didn't let anyone off the hook, and it was quite dark, and it felt, I think the argument for doing that, especially at that time, was we felt it was really necessary. And some people in the audience, depending on where we were, really, really took that to heart and felt incredibly sort of positively motivated by that shaking. And other people were just horrified. And we kept we wanted to kind of figure out, what's the right answer? What should we do? What should we do? Should we more dark, less dark? And we kept asking people, and we just got lots of different responses. And the sort of takeaway was that for something like this, which is so diverse, as you were saying, and attracts lots of different kinds of people to be interested in it, there was no right answer, and we sort of had to do our best to kind of thread the needle as best we could, and it has changed over time, it has lightened over time, and I think that probably has more to do with our sense of where the community as a whole is on this topic now versus 6 years ago.
It's very interesting to think about how things have changed in the last 6 years. For instance, when we were making the first initial asks for support, there was no guarantee that in some ways the university, but more particular the College of the Arts, would want to be associated with this message. We weren't sure about it. Does the College of the Arts have a place in talking about climate change in a red state at a time where it felt very tricky to do so? It even felt tricky for us risky, I would say, to broach this topic with our students who trusted us. And I think things really have evolved in the last 6 years since we began.
Something that relates to that connected to what Jason and Rob were talking about earlier today in terms of what's the role of the art piece, the art part, and the question of how does the art illustrate or depict some of these concerns, and I really grate against that whole notion as visual art or music being in the service of illustrating another idea. But setting that aside, I think what we're talking about now is that the visual imagery and the music really have a much more important role in terms of bringing us back from a state of being numb and a state of despair. I mean, I'm speaking personally, that the events of the last year and a half and you know, deeper into the past, in my experience, have had an impact of deep numbing. And so I think that what the visual art piece does for me is to provide an opportunity to draw people out of that and give them a sensory experience so that they can reconnect with feeling. You know, I think it goes back even to the early conversations that we had. What is feeling? What is emotion? What is the role in terms of transforming us inside, so that we can be receptive to the data, the information, the other pieces. Yeah.
And I think, you know, this whole notion of all of this is a communication project, is the way you talk about it. And as the creative artists in the endeavor, it was important that the music stood alone as music, and then the art stood alone as art, that they weren't underscoring or background, because exactly for what Rebecca just said, that when art or music, any artistic expression, is successful, one hopes, it allows the viewer, the apprehender, to take in that message that artist made with their craft, and to have an emotional and intellectual experience that they own. And so that's a different kind of processing than the processing you have when you absorb facts. Yeah. And the idea that I think sparked Rob wanting to do this was that he wanted this kind of learning and thinking to be at all of those levels. Right. And so it was really important as we were all, when we met that first retreat in Connecticut designing the project, was to know facts have their pride of place, the music has its pride of place, the photography has its pride of place, the paintings have their pride of place, but there needs to be thoughtful, careful transitioning from one to the next, so that it didn't feel like a bunch of blocks that were stuck next to each other, but that there was a fluid narrative, so that the audience was pulled through from the beginning to end, and having all of those kinds of experiences. And I think that is the challenge of making these kinds of works.
Wow, that was great.
Judy had a question.
Oh, I was just going to make the comment, thank you, Jason, for giving us this vocabulary, but this project is methodological polylocality.
Let's all say it.
I actually started
sentence.
I started creating a round that we can all
12
chant,
syllables.
because it's so rhythmic.
I'll just say,
Methodological problem.
you give me a great opportunity to say this. I only recently kind of came across this term. It's been a few months maybe, but I've always actually not liked calling it a communication project. I just didn't have another word, a term for it.
Yeah.
Performance
And that concept always helped us, because when it came time to make decisions, the question was, and even to what Robert, to get at what Robert was talking about, how dark it was, and we had these discussions about, do we want to keep it there? The answer to the question was never about what's the artistic content. It was about what's the goal of the project, and is it serving that goal? So that was a very useful, even, it's a clumsy way to talk about it as a communication project, but I don't call it a communication project anymore.
Right.
It's a cultural evolution project.
Ooh.
Wait.
It's a methodological polywocabulary.
What other
Cool.
questions do people have, comments? Yes.
So, I, just hearing you talk about, the performance, it made me think about the film that Philip Glass worked on with Reggio, the Koyaanisqatsi.
Yep.
Yeah.
What do you think of that as far as, because that was no language and just visuals, that was also very effective. What's your response to that piece, and then what you're doing now?
What is the question? Yeah.
Koyaanisqatsi, yeah.
Okay, so there was a film, Koyaanisqatsi, that came out with Philip Glass, and Reggio, and it's a visual, no language.
Right, I have it.
Yeah.
You've seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so so it fits this genre of
These two should be on a festival together, both programmed. And Philip should come, and there should be panel discussion.
But why did it impact you in?
Yeah,
why
well,
did
because
you-
when it came out, I think when that film came out, and seeing that cross-pollination of music and Glass's participation in this piece, and then the time-lapsing and the whole, cinematography of it, it really affected me, and it had a lot of impact, and it, made me think a lot about the world and that I was part of, and so it's just interesting because this is what you're doing as well, but yet there's another component to it, which is what you're doing.
Along that very line, Anne mentioned that we did two nascent performances of this project, where it was just, and even before the 2-hour version of the current project, we had this thing where it was like me talking for 15 or 20 minutes, and the quartet played some Shostakovich, I think, and we had a little bit with the dog, where we were talking about quartet as a metaphor for collaboration and that sort of thing. But between me talking and the bit with the quartet, we had 8 full minutes of silent imagery. So no music. And so last night, for those of you who went to the performance, there are a number of periods of silent imagery. Most of them are quite short, maybe 30 seconds or less, even 20 seconds. But there's one that's over 2 minutes, that's juxtaposing the developed world and the damage that it's built on. And you have to sit there for 2 or 2.5 minutes, and the squirm factor is pretty substantial, right? I mean, you see a little kid on a bicycle in suburban America next to a 9-year-old Chinese coal miner. But those first 2 performances had like 8 or 9 minutes of that, where you just had to sit with it. And it was very much inspired by this, you're just sort of forced to sit with it and not have anyone tell you anything. And ultimately we decided that was too long and too much, and we came to where we're at. But that was, I would say, these guys will all attest, highly resistant to making it shorter. No, they've got to sit with it. Ultimately, when we restructured it, it wasn't right. And how it is now is much better, but it was inspired by that kind of notion.
I would also just love to add, I loved that film, and there's so much wonderful work being done on so many fronts. with all just a little different cocktail. You know, I'm thinking of like James Baylog's work with Chasing Ice, and there's a whole lot of science in that film. For those of you who don't know the film, he set up. He's a photographer, but set up time-lapse cameras in really remote glacial areas in the world, and just creating the technology to do that was a big deal, and then getting it to these remote areas. And so we'd take a photo, I forget what the intervals of time were, and 6 months later they'd go back, and you could see these glaciers dying. So ultimately it's this incredible film, which is this, I mean, ice and water is beautiful, right? It's so stunning to look at, and photography is stunning, but it's also this other experience of it, to actually see making it possible for us to see what's not possible for us to see in these. That's just one example, but I think there's a whole cadre of creative people out there working in film and in theater and with music. Certainly Become Ocean, John Luther Adams' piece of a few years ago kind of was embraced by the Seattle Symphony and played beautifully, gives this visceral experience, and it's just sound, it's just music, but an incredible thing to sit through. It makes you feel like you're in the ocean. And you also feel how elemental and important it is to your survival somehow, without any words at all. And I think there's a place for all of it.
Another great example is Edward Vertinsky's film Watermark.
Yeah.
And his art is in the Crossroads project as well, but huge swaths of just film and music, and yet imparting very hard information. There's clearly information being given but he manages to do it with just sound music.
He has a new piece, and then you keep raising your hand, so I think we should go to her in a second. But he has I think it's Bertinsky who's doing this. There's a new film called Anthropocene. Maybe it's Jan Arthus Bertrand, I can't remember who we quote, believe what we know.
Yeah.
But I've seen the trailer like 100 times because the movie keeps not coming out. And I go look at the trailer, and it's just going to be amazing. And it's going to be mostly music and visuals. And it's just going to be amazing, yeah.
Yeah, back here.
I'm curious to hear ways in which you all are connecting with policymakers.
You're probably doing that the most directly, Rob.
I give quite a few public lectures on everything from climate change to the full sort of human sustainability, Anthropocene, planetary boundaries. And I get invited to meet with policymakers sort of in a one-on-one basis and take them through things in Utah, both some of our national policymakers and our state legislators, and all the way down to county and city councils. I've given presentations to city councils, county councils, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, Presbyterians, Quakers, Unitarians. The policymakers, so I interact with them mainly as giving them just sort of one-on-one presentations often, and then serving as a resource. They'll send me emails and say, well, I was talking to this other representative and he said this, this, and this, what can I say to that? And so I help with that. So it's not very artistic, it's just very straight science.
There have been rumblings at one point or another of having the Crossroads project actually performed in front of policymakers. But
Never quite have gotten it to happen.
no, and certainly in our state, one can easily imagine that there would be a lot of resistance to that actually having happened. But somebody will get really excited by it and try and make inroads into their connections, and then it just stalls.
I think we should just show up at the doors of the EPA.
Oh, they're beleaguered.
We need a guerrilla version.
I mean, there's no staff left there, so we wouldn't have much of an audience.
We need a Crossroads, electric van that we can just show up in.
Yeah.
we have advocates who've seen the performance in, like, there's like our token city council member, Herm Olson, who has seen it a number of times, and he's out there fighting the fight. I mean, in Utah, it's just, we're trying to arm the minority. But Rob gave a talk at a town hall that Mia Love hosted, and
So Mia Love is a Republican representative from Utah.
and she's pretty far right, and it was held at a for-profit college, and I went because there was a series called Years of Living Dangerously. I don't know if some of you know this series. There were a couple of seasons. And the crew was there to film this because it was an episode on Citizens Climate Lobby. And Citizens Climate Lobby is trying to create an equal number of Republicans and Democrats committed to basically passing a carbon tax. And so they were really courting Mia Love hard, and eventually prevailed. And Rob gave a talk there, and she was very, very careful in everything that she said. She kept her cards really close to the vest. But ultimately, they did get her on the Citizens Climate Lobby. And we, as a quartet, performed for the Rotary Club, and it was essentially a distilled Crossroads performance. It was not a receptive bunch.
Yeah.
It was a pretty, that was rough. But, like, one of the guys in the Rotary Club was my dentist.
Did you have to change dentists?
I'm thinking about it.
We will get, particularly when we do the performances in Utah, we did one, we've probably done 7 performances in Utah, and we did one in Ogden last year as part of a Intermountain Sustainability Conference at another university. And they made a big push to invite legislators.
Yeah.
And 3 or 4 showed up. They were sort of already on the team, as we've discussed, but Joel, what's his name? Anyway, so we don't make pushes per se, but we've had presenters who have tried to bring in policymakers to sit them down.
It seems like with this production especially, and you've mentioned a couple times when you were just starting and it was in its darker stages and embryonic in some ways, and how people walked out, and how politicians at the Rotary Club, isn't there a way that sometimes when I feel like that's the people I want to hear, that's the people, I want to hear what they have to say when they walk out. I just sort of get some kind of feedback rather than a walk away.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly heard from those people, Rob.
Is there you probably, yeah.
Well,
how that impacts the growth of your work as you evolve it.
It hasn't. I haven't really heard from people who walked out of the performance.
Right.
I hear from people who, when I'm giving a talk, and I gave a talk in southern Utah, which is very rural. Utah, by the way, is the most urban state in the nation. We have the highest percentage of our population lives in cities. If you look at Utah, you just can't hardly live anywhere. So it's all
along I-15.
But in the rural, like most places, the rural parts are more conservative. And I gave a presentation to a whole group of county commissioners, there were like 30 of them from 5 different counties, and they got pretty aggressive. Usually I'm pretty good at saying, where are you getting your information? That day I was kind of low on sleep and low on patience, and I got pretty warm behind the eyebrows myself. So that's not always useful. The performance itself, though, I'll emphasize again, as Robert brought out, it was designed to have a squirm factor. It was designed to have a squirm factor, not for people who don't understand that we have these problems, but for people who do understand, which is, I'm going to include all of us, but are not yet behaving to the level that we need to in response. And so it's meant to move us to response, and we got to you know, be uncomfortable enough to get pushed. And there's a combination of being uncomfortable and inspired, right? And it's always been trying to reach that. I've not heard from anyone who walked out of a performance, and I think the only walkouts we've ever really had that I would call walkouts because, oh my God, I'm not gonna sit through this, this is, you know, I don't agree with these things, was that performance. Yeah, other than that, and I would even argue that the people who walked out, that was a pulse. We don't know how it affected them. I'd like to know, like you said, Malcolm. But, you know, they left, but they didn't leave into a void. They left into a world where this is going to keep coming at them.
Well,
And we have to make sure it keeps coming at them.
into a world where the rest of their youth orchestra stayed. You know, also.
I'm a librarian, full disclosure, so.
Yay!
It is a yay thing. I don't get to sit in front of this much talent artistically too often. What do you guys see as what you would want preserved out of your outputs and present for future access or discovery when, you know, your time here is past and we want to look back at the 21st century and see what we were all grappling with? What would you want in the archive, in the library?
Great
Oh my
question.
God.
Never thought about that.
See? That's a common response, and I would love to hear, yeah.
I mean, if I may, I mean, I think on a certain level, it goes back to the multidisciplinary construct of this, which is on some level, we could distill it to all its component parts. So a beautiful hardbound 1,000-page catalog of all of Rebecca's paintings, some of which are in this project. There is a recording of both Rising Tide and Libby
Libby
Larson's
Larson's piece.
quartet, which is a second quartet that was commissioned for another component of this. Those recordings as concert pieces that people just listen to for the music. Rob's lectures as lectures, and then the beautifully produced video, archival video that's perfect,
Which is not yet.
which
made.
doesn't exist yet, that people can watch
Of
of the performance.
Yeah.
I mean, conceivably, there could be study guides, there could be, you know, audience feedback sessions. I mean, there could be
All kinds of
materials,
Yeah.
but I think as where we enter into it for the players of a quartet, they want their performances to be remembered. For the writer of the music that they performed, I want the music. For the visual artists, I mean, libraries don't have original artwork, but they have books of artwork.
Yeah.
You'd want your art, and you would probably want your talks, your lectures, and any
Well, the-
publications, and
the
then
script, I
the
guess,
piece.
maybe.
Script.
But
The
maybe
script.
your other writings, you know, like the work of Rob Davies, who's talked and written about this subject matter, but then the piece as its integrated whole. So that,
So I know a bunch of the librarians at Utah State, because we've worked on some folklore projects with them.
Yeah.
So are you working with your librarians at Utah State?
Increasingly, we are, yes,
Okay,
actually.
I'm just making like public service announcement.
And
So-
she's been really great at
Great.
reaching out.
Great, okay, great. We're all on board. That's
So-
all I have.
And actually, since you know, I'm guessing you know Randy Williams.
Yes.
So Randy's doing an oral history sort of project with a class on climate change,
Okay.
for which I'm giving a talk next week. And she's very interested in this. And so it hadn't even occurred to me to talk to her on this level, so I'm totally going to talk to her on this level
Awesome.
now, yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
I think we have time for one more question. How about in the back? Yeah.
One thing that I would find interesting is if you could get psychologists or behavioral scientists on board, because I'm wondering if you're actually reinforcing the viewpoint of those that don't believe that climate change is a reality. So that's something that I look at a little bit. I do leisure behavior, and so I look at a structuralist perspective of how I'll say free time for this venue. We don't really say free time in leisure studies, but it would be really interesting to know in the venue that you place these people in, if that makes them uncomfortable and retracts forward into their own viewpoint. So I think it would be very beneficial to look at that and to look look and see if you're actually reinforcing either side. And it sounds like you want this to be nonpartisan, but it seems like it is partisan in the talks that we're having here. And so I definitely just want to, bring that to attention. I know that your intent is to unite people, but I don't know if that's actually happening.
A couple things to say to that. I think first of all, as we mentioned earlier, our sense is that most of the people who come to this particular performance are already kind of believing in at least on some level that the science is true and that we are that we contribute to it. And so kind of pushing them away from that is a little bit hard to imagine. And I had another thought and it completely left my mind.
I agree. I would agree with Robert. This was our 38th performance. We've had one performance where we had the thing with the walkouts. So it's really, I agree. I think you worded it perfectly. It's hard to imagine that we're pushing people away, and that's certainly we've never gotten any feedback that I can't think of from performances. In the talkbacks we do after the performances, which we do for most of them, and then afterwards people come up and want to talk. I've never had anyone suggest that they were thinking maybe this was a thing, but now no.
Sure. I'm not saying you're going to change people. What I'm saying is whether they believe in it or not, they're going to be more reinforced because they already believe that. So it can go either way.
Yeah.
So the walkout is a small example, but
Yeah.
you may just already be reinforcing people that already believe in it, which is good. Whether or not that's going to have lasting impact, I don't know. Because one thing that we find is if we want to have behavior change, there has to be an incentive to change, really. And so climate change, I don't do climate change personally, but I just look at health behavior more so. And so there has to be an incentive. There has to be an incentive to do diet and exercise, right? To live a healthy lifestyle.
So the incentive that we try to get at in this performance is very much a moral, ethical, and we try to emphasize it at the very end with that bit where I say, "Who are we?" So were you at the performance?
No, I didn't even know it happened.
So-
I would have been though.
So there's
That's okay.
there's right at the very end, there's kind of a ramp up of this that is the sort of, it's not everyone's taking care of this, it's that we need to take care of it and we can sort of a thing. But there's a question, and we've had it's been in there most of the time we've been doing the performance in some form, which is an ask of the audience, who are we? Who are we? And it comes at the end of a piece that's been real powerful, showing you who we are in not very pretty terms. And saying, is this consistent with who we see ourselves to be? So that's the motivation that we give, and I would say that's the carrot in this performance as I see it.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful lines, and I've seen it in audience reactions, especially when we've done talkbacks immediately, is when after the "Who are we" is to take one thing and make it yours. And we've had really fascinating conversations with audiences when, I remember one person stood up and said, "I drive to this gig. I'm going to take the subway. That will reduce my," it was like, and then people said, "Well, I can't do that." And then do you remember that? There was that kind of an argument about, well, you come from privilege and you can do this and you don't. But it began a public debate or dialogue around, well, okay, we can't fix the big problem, but we can make small changes in our lives. And, well, what can I do? I mean, little things like, not buying plastic bottles every day. Like, I never thought about that before. I don't buy plastic bottles often, but now I don't. And, so it affects change and it allows for dialogue, and that dialogue, I think, has an impact that is about building community and changing us individually.
And by the way, you're as Rebecca said, we do have a social scientist working with us now. It's a small effort, but it's trying to get something. We agree with you that it would be great to have it studied. It's been hard to interest people in doing that, and not just interest them. It's a hard thing to do. Yeah, because it's periodic performances every few months.
I might also add just that from the very beginning we've been really careful not to reinforce along party lines, partisan lines.
Within the performance.
Yeah, it's very much meant to be a universal message. And I think a couple of times we have fallen back on referring to partisan stance. I mean, it is sort of a reality, but I think everybody is starting to realize what kind of a dead end that actually is. So from the very beginning, the performance has meant to be universal in this message.
And in the context of a panel discussion like this, where, things might go slightly farther down those lines, at least in terms of talking about a specific policy or a specific, but that's something that we actually pretty consciously avoid in the context of the performance itself, just to make it as human an issue as possible and not.
In fact, I had some really great partisan lines that the quartet axed. and rightly so. It's, when you're really into it, you write something that sometimes you don't even realize is gonna raise those hackles and issues. And when other people are looking at it, your collaborators, and they say, do you really want, maybe not.
Well, if I could add one more thing along those lines, I for one I resent that it's a partisan issue, because it is a universal issue, and it's this constant question, and a feature of our time to kind of how to bust through this. But Rob has reminded me on a number of occasions that actually it is in some ways an issue that should be political, because ostensibly our government and our politics is the way that we have a mechanism to make systemic changes or big sweeping changes that allow us to address these things. And if we had, an open dialogue and an easier representation, what the numbers tell us in terms of the population, the number of people who are concerned about this issue, there would, it's not consistent with the representation and with how much we're able to actually use that mechanism. And so it's just this crazy feature of our time right now. And I'd love to hear from you guys in the workshops how to navigate it effectively, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, when ignorance is being weaponized by a political party, it's going to be a political issue, and sometimes we just have to stand up in front of it and say, too bad.
Yeah.
It's going to be a partisan issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. It should be political. That's how we collectively address risk.
Right.
But it shouldn't be partisan.
Right.
Yeah. That's a weaponized ignorance.
That's
I'm
brilliant.
gonna write that down. That's a great one.
Well, guys, we're at the end of our panel discussion time, so let's thank these